With 2025 now firmly done and dusted, it's fair to say that it was a terrific year for the movies. But sometimes a filmmaker just misses the mark, whether a result of complacency, or studio meddling, or some other factor outside of their control, like, I don't know, an attack of killer bees or something. You don't know, it could happen. Bees or no bees, I'm Ewan, this is What Culture, and here are some of the most disappointing movies of 2025. First up, Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning. The eighth and apparently final Mission Impossible movie wasn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it did nevertheless fall far short of the expectations set by Tom Cruise and filmmaker Christopher McQuarrie over the past decade. Simply put, Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning is one of the most convoluted and outrageously bloated blockbusters of all time. A globe-trotting action film with way too many characters and subplots that also weirdly undermine the self-contained nature of the series itself. That is to say, The Final Reckoning bends over backwards to force contrived links to pretty much every prior entry in the franchise, most of which feel like the very sort of half-baked fan service McHugh himself actually criticized the other year. Like, yeah, the cast certainly tries really hard, and the set pieces are brilliant for the most part, but it's not at all as cohesive as the previous few installments, and feels like a bit of a tepid conclusion to an otherwise home-run directorial streak. And as an apparent conclusion to Ethan Hunt's story, it ultimately doesn't feel like much of an ending at all. A cinematic anticlimax if there ever was one. Next up, Tron Ares. Were many of us expecting brilliance from Tron Ares? Well, no, probably not, but in the very least, there were many who hoped it would deliver a visually appealing return to this distinct sci-fi world, backed by a banger score from Nine Inch Nails. And lo and behold, Ares' script is about as bare bones as you'd expect, and even though the VFX work is definitely impressive, without even a vague kernel of interest moving things forward, it quickly becomes an exhaustingly dull pyrotechnic showcase with Jared Leto, which is, makes things everything worse, doesn't it? Few of the new cast members make much of a dent with the wafer-thin material on offer, or lather-thin, and the inevitable tease for a fourth film which brings the Tron Legacy cast back into the fold is more frustrating than enticing, because we all knew this thing would flop at the box office. Like, surely Disney knew too. I mean, come on. The signs were there. But maybe the most annoying thing about this movie is that the Nine Inch Nails score is like, okay. Like, it has a banger accompanying single, As Alive As You Need Me To Be, which is so good, but everything else feels somewhat amorphous and unengaging, which is really annoying given how amazing Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross are, and how great they've been for movies overall over the past 15 years. Like, boys, come on, you could do better. Next up, After the Hunt. Considering Luca Guadagnino's track record of delivering smart, provocative, and engaging films of many genres, expectations were sky high for his new awards-courting dramatic thriller, After the Hunt. Guadagnino seemed like an inspired choice to dig into a story centered around a sexual abuse scandal in the post-Me Too era, and with a firecracker cast including Julia Roberts, Ayo Edebiri, Andrew Garfield, Michael Stuhlbarg, and Chloe Sevigny, it was easy to get swept up in the hype. But sad to say, After the Hunt premiered to wildly mixed reviews at the Venice Film Festival and fared no better when it hit general theaters in October. So what went wrong? Well, despite fine work from the cast, especially Roberts, After the Hunt was bogged down by a stamina-drainingly dull script, which manages to be extremely chatty while saying little of actual consequence, which is really bad given the subject matter on hand. As an attempt to excavate the nuances of its central premise, After the Hunt too often comes off as simplistic and maybe even a bit juvenile, marking a very rare miss for a brilliant director. On the way, A House of Dynamite. A House of Dynamite is another offering from a revered filmmaker which many just assumed would be a serious player in this year's awards circuit, but Catherine Bigelow's adrenalized new thriller fell off a cliff within days of bowing on Netflix. So yeah, although Bigelow's film has been lauded for its taut first act and the solid performances from its ensemble cast, its issues primarily lie in its repetitive structure and an ending that's unsatisfying by design. Bigelow opts to show the mad scramble to intercept a ballistic missile fired at Chicago from 3 different US perspectives. Yet the excessive overlap between these perspectives ultimately feels redundant at the expense of the overall suspense trying to be manufactured. Then there's the fact that Bigelow's finale, or rather non-finale, crucially refuses to show the outcome of the central scenario, ensuring the film concludes on an intentionally ambiguous note that left many deeply unsatisfied. Again, the technical and acting craft can't be disputed here, but as an urgent slice of gut-wrenching storytelling, it makes a few fundamental scripting missteps which undermine its own good work in other parts of its overall production. On the way, the Electric State. After the Russo brothers followed up Avengers Infinity War and Endgame with back-to-back duds in Cherry and The Gray Man, there was considerable hope that they'd bounce back with sci-fi adventure film The Electric State. But no, not really no. Despite there being considerable hype for this film due to it being based on an acclaimed novel by Simon Stålenhag and touting one hell of a buzzy ensemble cast led by Millie Bobby Brown and Chris Pratt too, I guess, and with a stonking $320 million budget on top, it seemed like it had everything it needed to realize the stunning vision of the source material on screen. But again, The Electric State marks the 3rd straight miss for the Russos, for while the VFX work is generally staggering throughout, the actual soul of the story and characters is ironically severely lacking. The loose approach to adapting Stålenhag's novel didn't help, resulting in a film that lacks its vibrant emotional core and leaves the cast merely going through the tired motions. Next up, Karate Kid Legends. The premise of Karate Kid Legends really seemed unscrew-upable, given that Netflix's Karate Kid sequel series Cobra Kai had already done most of the hard work, and all this follow-up had to do was bring Jackie Chan's Mr. Han from the 2010 remake, which I keep forgetting was a thing that actually happened, into the existing fold of the other movie's continuity. But Legends is a mostly listless rehash of the creaky Karate Kid formula, which commits the especially unforgivable sin of relegating both Mr. Han and Daniel LaRusso, the latter played by Ralph Macchio, to meager supporting roles. But mess it up they did. Daniel does not show up until the 3rd act and gets just a few half-baked interactions with Mr. Han, ensuring this absolute slam dunk of a premise is handled in the most weirdly banal, forgettable manner imaginable. It's also breathlessly paced to the point of exhaustion, with its 94-minute runtime flying by in a frantic flash, enough that none of the dramatic beats nor any of the fight scenes are given a moment to sit still. Ben Wang does at least acquit himself well as our new Karate Kid, even if his efforts were largely wasted on such a non-event of a movie. Next up, Havoc. Gareth Evans is one of the most intriguing action filmmakers to emerge over the last 15 years, and when it was revealed that the Raid director would next be working on a crime thriller with Tom Hardy of all people, it seemed like a perfect pairing. And while Havoc does deliver a few diverting set pieces, though certainly not that nauseatingly bad CGI car chase, it all feels decidedly sleepier and less energetic than the Raid movies, while saddled with a threadbare plot and peaceful characters you won't really remember once you finished watching the movie. This in turn stifles the performances of a game cast, especially the always great Timothy Olyphant and Forrest Whitaker, both of whom are just criminally wasted here. And even if you can switch your brain off throughout the dialogue, the action just doesn't cut it either. Hopefully Evans will rebound with his already shot next film, A Cult Is My Passport, because this was one of the biggest letdowns of the decade so far. And speaking of letdowns, we have The Running Man. Edgar Wright's beloved filmography speaks for itself, and he certainly seemed like an inspired choice to tackle a new adaptation of Stephen King's classic dystopian novel, The Running Man. But this is easily the most forgettable, generic, un-Edgar Wright film the director has ever produced. An ironically incredibly corporate and polished product that lacks most of the visual flair and cynical wit the filmmaker is typically known for. The satire is broad and on the nose, but forgets to be fun as well. The majority of the cast is wasted save for an admittedly brilliant Colman Domingo, and 133 minutes in length, it feels punishingly overlong too. And this is all without even getting into the film's disappointingly sanitized finale, which teases a commitment to the dark original ending of King's source novel, only to just pull the rug out at the last moment. So yeah, needless to say, the 1987 Arnie version remains effortlessly undefeated. Here's hoping Wright bounces back soon, because between this and Last Night in Soho, I'm just not feeling his recent work. Let me know what you think he should do down in the comments below. Next up, A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey. Man, this one really stings. Kogonada's first two films, Columbus and After Yang, were highly distinct works in wildly different genres, and so it was easy to be optimistic about his take on a romantic fantasy yarn, especially with Margot Robbie and Colin Farrell starring. And while A Big, Bold, Beautiful Journey boasts some enticing visuals, it's ultimately a naffly twee, overwrought love-in that fundamentally falls apart because, as well paired as they seem on paper, Robbie and Farrell have no romantic chemistry whatsoever. Now, tellingly, this is the first of Kogonada's 3 films that he didn't also write, and it's painfully clear that he struggled to translate Seth Reese's maudlin, exhausting script into something that functions on even a basic emotional level. In retrospect, the poor test screenings and Sony's decision to send it out to die with minimal marketing aren't remotely surprising. It's a film that, for all of its superficial allure, just doesn't work at all. On the way, Jurassic World Rebirth. Now, it would be ridiculous to expect genuine greatness from the Jurassic Park franchise at this point, considering it hasn't produced a single worthy sequel to the original, except maybe 3, which has the William H. Macy juice and also the Spinosaurus, who's like the coolest dinosaur ever. But even so, it was tough not to be intrigued when Gareth Edwards, the guy behind Godzilla and The Creator, was revealed to be directing the 7th installment in the franchise. Plus, with Jurassic World Rebirth leaving both the OG heroes and the Chris Pratt era characters behind, it seemed like a fine enough opportunity for a fresh start, led by the appealing trio of Scarlett Johansson, Mahershala Ali, and Jonathan Bailey. But no, Jurassic World Rebirth was ultimately more the same warmed-over schlock we've been getting for the past 10 years. A tedious greatest hits of the franchise with few fresh ideas of its own, and precious little audiences are likely to remember once the end credits roll. Save, that is, for maybe like one of the most insane instances of product placement in movie history, as the film's catastrophic events are kickstarted by a Snickers. Of course, not that that matters though, because the actual franchise itself is basically critic-proof, because we're all desperate for more dino content. So it made loads of money at the box office, and more are on the way. So yeah, maybe another studio can like come along and make a good dinosaur movie just to save us, just to feed us a bit of something delectable that's dino-y, please. Maybe a Turok movie? Maybe? I don't know. It's just something good, please. Next up, Jay Kelly. Even before we were in 2025, the early awards buzz for Noah Baumbach's new film, Jay Kelly, was off the charts, with many pundits believing that George Clooney and Adam Sandler would be strong contenders for Best Actor and Best Supporting Actor Oscars. And Baumbach's latest definitely isn't a bad time, but it absolutely is one of his weakest offerings to date. A dramedy that's so broad and at times sappy that it feels totally unrecognizable as a Baumbach movie at all. Clooney and Sandler do fine work here, and there are absolutely some scene-stealing supporting performances, especially Billy Crudup, but this is constantly offset by an abundance of cornball schmaltz and a wink-wink, self-aware tone that's often more smug than it is actually charming. Ultimately, it's easily digestible Netflix comfort food with two much-loved actors hanging out in picturesque locations, which is probably the last thing you'd ever expect to say about a Noah Baumbach film, but here we are. On the way, highest to lowest. Even when you're a filmmaker as celebrated as the great Spike Lee, remaking a classic Akira Kurosawa film is just asking for trouble. And while a modern-day reimagining of Kurosawa's 1963 police procedural High and Low had some measure of potential, especially with Denzel Washington in the lead role, this ended up being one of the sloppiest and most confused offerings of Lee's entire career. The scripting and directing feel so flat and so weirdly corny that it almost feels like Lee made the film sarcastically, as though to thumb his nose at the many people who trashed his obviously poorly planned remake of Old Boy, which, good lord, I forgot that thing even existed as well. Washington tries, because of course he does, he's one of the greatest actors ever, and it has a few punchy sequences, but for the most part, this is a strangely dull, poorly paced remake that also has the misfortune of featuring one of the most hilariously out-of-place musical scores of the entire year, or really any other. Next up, The Lost Bus. In the months leading up to its premiere at TIFF back in September, The Lost Bus was gassed up by many pundits as a surefire awards player, given that it's adapted from an acclaimed book, which was itself written about the deadliest wildfires in California history. Plus, with the ever-reliable Paul Greengrass behind the camera and Matthew McConaughey and America Ferrera in front of it, it seemed like quite the appealing package for Oscar voters and general audiences alike. Ultimately though, The Lost Bus is a perfectly watchable, based on true events thriller, albeit one that in its bones feels incredibly workmanlike. The extremely by-the-numbers expository script allows Greengrass to basically sleepwalk his way through directing this, affording him few opportunities to flex his filmmaking chops, as we remember so brilliantly in the Bourne movies and also Captain Phillips. McConaughey and Ferrera are both meanwhile good, but the film as a whole simply lacks the bruising impact you'd expect from such a fascinating setup, proving itself content to merely settle for adequate human interest fare you'll stream once and then never think about again. On the way, Honey, Don't. There was much optimism that the second entry in Ethan Coen's lesbian B-movie trilogy following Drive Away Dolls would be a sure step up, especially with Margaret Qualley this time playing a hard-boiled detective type and starring alongside Aubrey Plaza and Chris Evans. That's a great ensemble no matter which way you slice it. But sadly, Honey Don't was another big swing and a miss from Coen, a sporadically amusing but incredibly messy outing that failed to make the most of its clearly game cast. There is so much easy potential here, but as ever, it comes down to the writing, and Coen and his wife Tricia Cook just couldn't find enough worthwhile to do with these memorably kooky characters to make it all gel together. For the many among us who are chomping at the bit to see the Coen brothers back together after spending almost a decade working on their own projects, their last joint venture being 2018's The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, Honey Don't is yet further proof that the reunion just can't come soon enough. Next up, the Fantastic Four First Steps. Disney tried their absolute damnedest to sell the Fantastic Four First Steps as the most important MCU movie in years. In addition to kickstarting Phase 6, it would also link directly to the all-important upcoming tentpole Avengers Doomsday, and by extension, its sequel, Secret Wars. And what can really be said about the new Fantastic Four? Well, it's fine. Like, totally fine. It's certainly better than any of the previous Fantastic Four films, but that's clearing quite a low bar. This is competent yet unremarkable work, a passable ensemble superhero flick, but one that leaves the titular supergroup making shockingly little impression. Given that the Fantastic Four are going to be a major fixture throughout Phase 6 and perhaps even beyond, this was far from a fully persuasive coming out party for them, both in terms of its generic story and the so-so chemistry between its cast, which again, speaking as a Fantastic Four fan, the chemistry between these guys is the most important thing, and this casting overall just didn't seem to gel that well. Overall, I can't help but feel that between this film and the whole Doctor Doom stuff with RDJ, Marvel have once again whiffed their founding family in live action, which is just all kinds of annoying. On the way, Keeper. After delivering two of the wildest and most memorable horror films of the past few years in Longlegs and The Monkey, Osgood Perkins seemed primed to deliver a bonkers trifecta with his most recent effort, Keeper. While star Tatiana Maslany once again gives a strong performance in the lead role, this singularly deranged riff on the typical cabin-in-the-woods logline is ultimately too spare and meandering for its own good. It has a compelling setup and some vibes-rich imagery to boot, but the film ultimately feels more like an intriguing short concept that was needlessly distended out to feature length, considering the utter slog that is the film's leaden middle act. And yeah, it probably didn't help either that Neon marketed the film as another wild romp from the guy who made Longlegs and The Monkey, where this is, in fact, a decidedly more quiet and subdued folk horror that unfortunately lurches into genuine tedium on occasion. Next up, the Phoenician scheme. Now, Wes Anderson seems positively unbothered by those who suggested he's fallen off a bit in recent years. The likes of The French Dispatch and Asteroid City show him at his most complacent. Although I will say I really liked Asteroid City especially, but I digress. Either way, there are many who would now argue that Anderson has completed a confident but forgettable trilogy with the Phoenician scheme. Another kooky, stylish, well-acted caper with so desperately little interesting going on underneath the hood. That is to say, it's Anderson at his safest, doing all the things you expect him to do, which at this point in his career is a little disappointing. Now, to be clear, no one is saying that Anderson needs to radically change up his style, but the sameness of his aesthetic and storytelling devices has ultimately diluted the impact of his output in recent years. In short, it's an incredibly okay Wes Anderson film that just feels like the filmmaker reheating his own nachos. We've all had this meal before, and it was better the last time, and it was even better the time before that. Next up, Love Hurts. After Ke Huy Quan won a well-earned Best Supporting Actor Oscar in 2023 for his superb performance in Everything Everywhere All at Once, his fans were hopeful that he'd suddenly be showered with juicy roles and even get a few choice star vehicles of his own. And honestly, on paper, Love Hurts actually seemed like a fine fit for Quan's skills as an actor and stunt choreographer, casting him as a seemingly mild-mannered estate agent who also happens to be a retired hitman. This had the potential to be Quan's John Wick or maybe even Nobody, but it was largely panned by critics and flopped at the box office in the aftermath of those initial wave of reviews. Though Quan gives a solid performance here and is easily the one thing that emerges from the movie as its best feature, the film as a whole is woefully underwritten. The central romance between Quan and the far younger Ariana DeBose isn't remotely believable, and at just 83 minutes in length, it's clearly been cut to within an inch of its life by a panicked studio. Between this and his role in the aforementioned The Electric State, Quan's post-Oscar run hasn't gotten off to the best start. He's hoping for a change of fortunes in 2026. Next up, Black Phone 2. Black Phone 2 is a quintessential sequel to a film that really didn't need it, but since when has that ever stopped the horror genre, let's be real. Though Scott Derrickson's penchant for crafting uneasy atmosphere remains undefeated here, this is still a messy follow-up that features a frustrating lack of Ethan Hawke's The Grabber in its first half, before reintroducing him as a rather listless Freddy Krueger-like guy in the second half of the movie. And even once The Grabber returns, this is shockingly tame fare for the most part. The modern-day body count is basically non-existent, which kind of undercuts the impact of the Grabber's new form. Add to that the fact that some of the revelations related to the Grabber's backstory also come off as desperate and contrived, only further fueling the notion that Black Phone 2 was forced into existence because the first one made a lot of money, and because anyone involved had a genuinely inspired idea for an actual follow-up. But given that this sequel was also a massive box office success, Black Phone 3 is pretty much inevitable. On the way, Alpha. Alpha is the third film from French director Julia Ducournau, following her acclaimed horror debut Raw and the Palme d'Or winning second film Titane, and takes place in a world where an AIDS-like disease slowly turns the bodies of those infected to marble. Now, considering all of those aforementioned plaudits, it was kind of just assumed that Alpha was guaranteed to be another winning fusion of mind-bending body horror, rich thematics, and sharp character work from the filmmaker. But sadly, this one's just a bit of a mess. But though the central performances are solid, especially from Tahar Rahim, and it boasts some memorable visuals, the overall execution is ultimately quite lacking. As an AIDS allegory, it's all very obvious and unremarkable, and the pacing throughout is positively sluggish, ensuring its 128-minute runtime feels at least 20 or 30 minutes too much. Alpha has been basically sent out to die since its underwhelming premiere at Cannes, skipping most major festivals and getting a low-key international release, while US distributor Neon plans to quietly dump it this coming March. Given Ducarneau's enormous talent though, there's a good chance she rebounds with whatever her next project ends up being.